So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Iolanda Fresnillo. I'm with Eurodad. I'll be facilitating this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining. The first thing before starting, let me mention that we have translation available in Spanish and French. So you can have in the bottom part of your screen, there is like a globe, and you can push there and click there, and you can have the different languages. Second, we will be recording this webinar, so it will be available afterwards online in the Eurodad YouTube channel, at least. And also, before we start, I would like to thank very much those organizations supporting this event and participating in the organization, especially the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection in Zambia, also Afrodad, African Forum for a Network on Debt and Development, Jubilee Debt Campaign UK, and Erlassjahr from Germany. Together with Eurodad, we start talking about organizing some kind of event around what was happening in Zambia. And we thought it would be a good occasion, not just to talk about the situation in this one country, but also about the different news that were announced in the last G20 meetings regarding the common framework for debt treatment. For that, and I'll also repeat my thanks. We have different speakers today. We will be speaking with Tim Jones, Head of Policy at the Jubilee Debt Campaign UK. We will try to understand with him what lies under this new or newish common framework for debt treatment, but especially what has led to the default in Zambia. Let me also thank and welcome Muchimba Siamachoka. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. She's a program officer on social and economic development at the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection in Zambia. And we will speak with her about the situation in the country and what are the implications of this debt default and the whole process for the people in Zambia. After those two speakers, we will spend around half an hour, 40 minutes with them. We also ask Jason Braganza, Executive Director at Afrodad, and Juana Sotomayor, a Human Rights Officer at the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, working with the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and Human Rights, to comment on the presentations and also on the specific situation in Africa with Jason and chances for other defaults, and also on the impacts on human rights in general of what was discussed by the speakers today. We hope to have time for at least half an hour questions, answers, and comments with you all. You can write your questions at the Q&A box, also at the bottom of the screen. And if we have time, we will open the mics for discussion. Let me start by doing a very short introduction on what is the context in terms of the answers from the lenders represented by the G20. We had in April, yeah, this is the speakers and the respondents. We had in April the announcement of this DSSI initiative, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, that granted debt payments temporary suspension with 1 year grace, and at the beginning it was 3 years period for repayment. In the extension announced in October, from these 3 years, we passed into 5 years from next year onwards. Sorry. Only 73 countries were eligible for this initiative, And from those, 46 have so far applied, and so far it's $5.3 billion US dollars confirmed of the payments being temporarily postponed. This is only a portion of the payments that both eligible countries and developing countries are actually making to their lenders, including multilateral and private lenders. Last October, we saw how the G20 committed to an extension of the initiative until June 2021. Potentially, it will cover around 44% of the payments by these 46 countries that have so far requested participation, but more than half of the payments will still be made during this half part of the year. That is with the data that the World Bank provides us with, which is not as comprehensive and as detailed as we would like and as updated as we would like. And they will probably discuss a further extension during the spring meetings in April, the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. As you probably know, this DSSI excludes middle-income countries, so leaves a lot of countries with debt distress and with debt difficulties and vulnerabilities out of the initiative. And it's also excluding multilateral and private creditors. And in October, we were already told that the creditors, especially bilateral creditors, together with the IMF and the World Bank, were discussing this common framework for debt treatment beyond the DSSI. This was finally announced in early November during an extraordinary meeting of the G20 finance ministers. I'm going to summarize what this new or newish framework provides, and leave it to Tim to explain and analyze a little bit the shortcomings of it. First is that the common framework offers mainly debt reprofiling, so rescheduling of the debt payments only for DSSI eligible countries upon request of those countries. As it says in the communique and the statement of the G20 finance ministers, these debt treatments will not be conducted in principle in the form of debt write-off or debt cancellation. The main change we see from existing mechanisms is that both China and other non-Paris Club lenders are going to sit on the table with Paris Club lenders for the discussions. As it happens with other restructuring processes before this common framework, countries need to seek an IMF program before being granted any debt treatment, which the big question mark there is it going to open a door for further austerity programs? The IMF and World Bank will provide that sustainability analysis, and those bilateral lenders with debt owed to them will assess that DSA and decide what to offer to the borrowing country. And this borrowing country will need to seek common treatment also from private lenders. Multilateral lenders are excluded from this framework. So Tim, welcome first. Thank you for joining us. I'm gonna stop sharing this now.
Hi, Iolanda. Hi, everybody.
Hi. More than 500 organizations signed a statement last October demanding debt cancellation, unconditional cancellation of public external debt payments by all lenders for all countries in need. From your point of view, how this common framework, this announcement falls short of that demand from the civil society?
Yeah, so this new common framework kind of falls short on all the different areas that civil society was demanding debt cancellation. So firstly, civil society was calling for cancellation of debts, and this common framework is mainly around pushing debt payments into the future, spreading them out. That might involve a bit of debt cancellation, but it explicitly says that they will try and avoid that. When actually a lot of it is building on this system for debt restructuring, which already exists, where the IMF and World Bank say whether they think a debt is sustainable, and then they set the amount a debt needs to be reduced by to make it sustainable again. And normally they do that in such a way that a country is still assessed by them to be at high risk of not being able to pay their debts, and so still left with high debt payments. So even on the face of it, any country that went through this framework that successfully does it, even on its own terms, it would only reduce that country to having debt payments that still meant it was at high risk of not being able to pay and still had very high debt payments. So it just doesn't reduce much debt, even if it happens. It's not comprehensive, so it only applies to debts owed to other governments. Debts owed to multilateral institutions like the World Bank are excluded, and we'll come on, I think, to talk about debts to private lenders. And it's not all countries in need. It's just only the 73 countries eligible for the debt service suspension initiative are able to ask for this debt treatment. Many other countries in need across the world, the likes of Argentina or Ecuador, or some of the small island states like Jamaica, are just excluded from this, even though they are some of the countries with the highest debt payments.
Thank you, Tim. Just a comment on that last point. There are also excluded, and you mentioned some of those countries that are actually suffering from climate change events, for like the countries in Central America. I'm just mentioning that because we will probably have news from our colleagues in Central America on a solidarity action requesting debt cancellation on those countries. So Jubilee Debt Campaign and other CSOs working on debt have been denouncing for a long time now that if private creditors are not included in the debt relief efforts, what happens actually is that the very little debt relief that could be offered, and as you said, that would be almost nothing under this framework, but also IMF new lending, emergency lending, will be actually going into bailing out these private creditors. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this common framework aims to engage or fails in engaging these private creditors?
Yeah, so what the common framework says is that any debtor country that wants the debt treatment has to seek the same reduction, change in debt terms from private lenders as it will get from the other governments in the G20. So firstly, that is putting all the onus on the debtors. So you've got this G20 group of supposedly most powerful countries in the world that is saying to debtor countries, if you want some debt relief from us, you have to go and get the same terms from private creditors, but then we're not going to do anything to help you do that. So they're not giving the debtor governments any tools in those negotiations when they go to private creditors, most of which are based in the G20 governments. Of the debts owed by the countries eligible for this scheme, over 99% of their international debts are legally owed either under English law or New York law, with probably about 90% owed under English law. So those two governments, the UK and the US, could pass legislation to change the terms that said that private creditors have to cancel debt down to any level agreed by the G20, and so that those private creditors can't sue if a country defaults or takes part in a debt restructuring as asked for by the G20. There's other things that they could have done, such as a UN Security Council resolution, again, in the power of the G20, but they've not done so. So you have a debtor government that is told you've got to go and negotiate, but not given the tools to do it. But then they're also told you just have to seek this reduction from private lenders, what the G20 don't say is what happens when inevitably the private lenders say, no, we're not going to change the terms of the debt. And there, the G20 should again be giving debtor governments power and tools, saying you can default on the debt, stop paying the private lenders. We will support you in that. We will help you through that. And the G20 haven't done any of that. So on the reading of it, what is most likely to happen is if a debtor government does this, they write to the private creditors say no, and then nothing else happens. And the private creditors keep getting paid. And the private creditors keep getting paid out of money that is saved from the payments that are not being made to other governments like China. So effectively, that's one way this is bailing out the private creditors, and it's unfair on the lenders who are doing any debt reduction that the private lenders keep getting paid in full. But also, kind of away from this common framework, a main thing that's happening at the moment is that the IMF and World Bank are lending more money. And in many cases, it's those loans that are being used to make the high interest payments to private lenders. So again, private lenders are just getting paid off by public money from the IMF. Just quickly, at the moment, the IMF is in negotiations with Kenya over a 3-year loan program, where the IMF is proposing $2.3 billion of loans to Kenya. And over the same time period, Kenya is due to pay $2.3 billion to private lenders, mainly in interest. So those IMF loan, if it's agreed, will just go from the IMF and then straight out to the private lenders, unless there is some kind of debt restructuring, some way of forcing private lenders to comply. But the IMF is not proposing that at the moment, even though it should under its own rules.
Thank you, Tim, for this very comprehensive explanation. It seems clear to me, but I might be wrong, that this common framework won't change very much the situation for countries like Zambia that have been negotiating with private lenders. So let's move into the main issue of the webinar. But we thought it would be good to have this introduction on this new common framework, because that's the context where we are today. So Zambia defaulted on a payment to private creditors a couple of weeks ago. The question would be, how did the country got to that point? And if I'm right or wrong on how this common framework would make the situation or the process, the negotiation process, different for a country like Zambia. On to you again.
So for this, I'm going to try and share with you one graph to help explain it. I've only one. I'm not going to inundate you with too many graphs. So, and I'm speaking just really in terms of what's happened with the lenders in relation to Zambia. And obviously Muchimba can give you much more detail on what's actually happened within Zambia and this perspective within the country. But this graph here shows loans to the Zambian government from people outside the country, whether that's private lenders, other governments, or institutions like the World Bank over recent years. And the story in some ways starts in 2012 when Zambia borrowed its first, what sometimes called a Euro bond. It just means it's a kind of debt called a bond that's borrowed in foreign currency in the US dollars. And that was in 2012. It was when copper prices were high and the Zambian economy was growing, and when interest rates were very low in the Western world and private lenders were looking to lend elsewhere. And that loan is the blue bit of the graph in 2012, and it was lent an interest rate of 5.4%. Now, a couple of years later, from 2014, the copper price was falling through 2014 to 2016, which then created more financial pressures for the Zambian government. And it borrowed 2 more of these bonds. So again, that's the big blue bars in 2014 and 2015. But this time, the private lenders were now less confident about Zambia's ability to pay. So they thought they could charge Zambia more money. So then on those 2 loans, they charged 8.5% and 9% interest. So across those 3 loans, that was already creating a big debt payment burden for Zambia just on the interest. Now, throughout this time, the green bits of all the bars is loans from China, which is a significant part of the story, although some in Western governments and in the private lenders pretend that China is, if it was the only lender to the Zambian government. In reality, 27% of Zambia's external debt is owed to China, compared to 49% owed to private lenders. Now, the third part of the story is what's been happening really since around 2017. So since then, these bonds, the blue bars, get traded on financial markets every day, and that means you can see a few things about them. And since 2017, they've been trading at well below face value. So speculators have been buying Zambian government debt, say $100 of debt, for $60 or $40. Now, the reason they're doing that is because since 2017, they've expected Zambia to not be able to pay. So it's been several years. The default that happened last month has been expected for several years. That also means that when they're trading at that level, Zambia hasn't been able to borrow more in these bonds to help borrow in order to pay the interest. And so you'd see there's not been any more of the blue graph since. And the people who've been buying the bonds are set to make huge profits if they're paid in full. We estimate up to 250% profit if they Zambian government paid them in full. What has happened since 2017 is these orange bars are direct loans from commercial banks. And we don't know much more about them because they're very secret, they're very opaque. So we don't know what the interest rates charged on them are, but they've been given and they've effectively helped meet the interest payments, help cover the Zambian government's budget deficit over this period. But it's likely they've been at very high interest rates. So through this 2017 to 2019, Zambia has just been borrowing more in order to just keep paying the interest. And at the same time, its foreign currency reserves have been declining. And then last month, it finally stopped in that strategy in some way and stopped paying because there weren't the reserves, there wasn't the willingness of private lenders to lend anymore. So say of Zambia's government debt today, about 50% is owed to private lenders, 27% to China, the rest is owed to institutions like the World Bank and other governments. So I'll stop. Now, in terms of how then the common framework might impact on Zambia, well, firstly, you could just ignore it and try and do debt restructuring deals with China and with the private lenders separately. And I think those negotiations have already begun. It could try and use the common framework, so it's eligible for it. So an advantage for doing that would be, it could be a way to try and force a negotiation between China and the private lenders altogether. It is very frustrating. The private lenders just keep saying, well, you need to reach a deal with China. China says, well, it's the private lenders, so the main people that you owe money to. So you could try and force that negotiation to happen at the same time. But to do that, the Zambian government would have to be very proactive because the G20 framework does not automatically do that. So they would need to be very explicit about how much debt needed to be reduced to make it sustainable, probably well beyond what the IMF and World Bank say, so that it's not just a kicking the can down the road, but actually getting the kind of reduction that's needed to make debt sustainable into the future. And they would need to, they'd still be in negotiations with those lenders and need to be force them into a good deal by saying you either accept this or we remain in default and you don't get anything. So the point about a default is that that's how you force private lenders to negotiate with you, because it's the prospect of them getting nothing at all is what means they might agree to a bigger debt cancellation. Now there's some rules that the IMF has that Zambia could try and use, like the IMF is not meant to lend to a country where its debt is unsustainable like Zambia, but actually once it's defaulted on that debt, that IMF is now allowed to lend. So although the IMF doesn't publicize that very much, that's one of the things that the Zambian government could use to force private lenders into negotiation and to say, actually, this default is very legitimate. It's what we had to do in order to have a sustainable debt in the future.
Thank you, Tim. That was very interesting. I'm gonna go on to Muchimba now. Hi. So Tim has told us about how this debt mounted and what is the situation faced in terms of debt negotiation in Zambia today. But we would like to ask you a little bit of what is the situation for the people in the country? What impacts does this elevated debt have in the population in Zambia? So on to you,
Okay,
Muchimba.
thank you so much, Iolanda. I hope you can get me clearly. So I will just give a background and I'll share my screen. Great, I'm sure that's visible to everyone. So just to give a current context of where we are as a country, really the Zambian scenario right now is just depicted by the picture that I've shared here. Of course, just like the global world, we do have the climate change discourse that is taking place. And for Zambia, particularly because we've been very dominant on rain-fed agriculture, I could speak to hydroelectricity generation. And because of issues such as climate change, what we've noted is that certain sectors of the economy have not been performing well. And I could speak particularly to the manufacturing sector. Of course, the next picture there shows sinking sand. And just as Tim has given a background, we're looking at the entire debt discourse itself. And globally, beyond that, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that no nation can really run away from. In as much as this is a health crisis, what we've noted is that the social and economic implications have also affected the Zambian economy. Beyond that, the other pictures will just tell you that Zambia is the second largest copper producing country in Africa. But even with that, what we've noted is that it's very seldom that this actually trickles down to the Zambian people themselves. Of course, we are characterized by issues such as poverty, but beyond that, we have certain sectors such as tourism. And in the picture there, we see the Victoria Falls. Of course, this has always been one of the low-hanging fruits to grow the economy, but the challenge really with COVID-19 has been that we must stay home and we must social distance. So this is just to give you a background of what has been happening. So to build on to what Tim has shared, and please just let me know if I'm too fast. We have here on the slide macroeconomic principles in Zambia. So what we've noted over the years really from 2012 to date is that the kwacha has continued to depreciate against stronger currencies such as the US dollar. So for this year itself, from January to date, our currency has depreciated by over 40%. So the current rate is about 21.15, where this is for one kwacha to $1. So really with the debt discussion, this causes a huge bearing on the obligatory payments that we have, because what the scenario is really we need more and more kwacha to actually repay any amounts that are due, any interest payments that are due, or principal payments in itself. So the next economic principle that I would like to speak to is our rising inflation rate. So what we've noted, and the figures there are just simply showing us a picture from October 2019 to October 2020, which is this year. So Zambia is largely an import-driven economy. So when we experience exchange rate fluctuations, what we've noted is that the cost of goods and services does actually go up. But the cost of living in itself is not really a problem if people can afford it. But the other side of the coin is really that incomes themselves have remained largely stagnant. And we also don't have sufficient policies that can address various inequalities. And just to speak to this a little bit more, with the inflation rate, what we've noted is that the food inflation rate has actually been the larger chunk of inflation that has fluctuated. So that just still highlights the day-to-day struggles that different individuals will face. And particularly, this becomes a challenge in terms of fiscal space of government to actually respond and provide people with certain social protection measures, with decent employment creation that can actually ensure that they're able to meet their day-to-day costs. So just to go on and paint a picture, I know Tim did allude to the fact that the fiscal deficit has been widening even as this debt has grown. So I could speak to the 2020 national budget. This is our budget currently under implementation. So before COVID-19 happened, we had a deficit of about 17.2 billion kwacha. And if I convert this to US dollar, just to bring this into perspective, this is about over 800 million kwacha. So surprisingly, the deficit itself was actually close to the combined allocation of our social protection, our health, and our education. So you get to understand that if a deficit is mainly financed by borrowing and then COVID happened, it really just highlights some of the challenges that we are facing on the ground. And to go on, if we looked at the debt stock, so this is a US dollar dominated debt. So because of that, we are still requiring more and more kwacha. And even with the debut of the Euro bonds from 2012 up to date, what we've seen is that it has become a challenge even for us to meet some of these obligations, especially because I could say $10 today is not what $10 was 10 years ago. So this is just to paint a picture for everyone listening. So beyond that, another economic indicator that I could refer to is our gross domestic product. Of course, for this year, we had a target of 3%, that is from our annual budget. But what we noted is that we are currently at negative 4.2% as a result of the pandemic. But of course, there are different other challenges that have really compounded the growth of the Zambian country. So definitely with such growth rates, it doesn't spur much confidence for the year ahead. And this is just the global scenario that a number of people are facing. So if I could speak to the situation on the ground in terms of highlighting these macroeconomic indicators, that's what I would just easily speak to in summary. But to get to Iolanda's question, when we look at the implications of debt itself, so I'll just pick on a few sectors, and mostly we will focus on the social sector allocation because we know that is where the poor and vulnerable in society are actually housed. So in terms of health, and I think it's very important to highlight the challenge that we've had with rising debt obligations is that it affects our budgetary allocation. And this is because government has to set aside certain percentages of the budget to service the debt that we owe. But then that leaves very little for other sectors, for instance, such as health. So here in this graph, we've noted very stressed health systems. And when we look at the budget allocations from the year 2014 to the year 2020, this is all the blue bars. These are all below the Abuja Declaration. So Zambia is signatory to a number of international conventions. So one of them is the Abuja Declaration, where we have committed to allocate at least 15% of our national budget on an annual basis towards the health sector. But this hasn't been actualized, and this is because of competing needs on the ground. So I'll quickly move on to my next slide. And this is just to highlight some of the challenges that have been faced within the informal sector. So over 71% of our population, Zambia has a population of close to 18 million, is actually housed within the informal sector. So we know the informal sector is one that is characterized by uncertain income. We know social securities are not available for various different people. So because of COVID-19, what we noted was that business transactions themselves have continued to subdue. But beyond that, the exchange rate that has fluctuated, and Tim did allude to this fact that our international reserves have been going down because of our debt obligations, because the kwacha hasn't been performing well. Even when we get to the ground, some of the marketeers that are selling produce definitely have been affected by the exchange rate fluctuations. And this is because we are largely import driven. I'll give a quick example of fruits. We depend on South Africa for a number of citrus fruits. These are apples and oranges. So certainly when the kwacha is not performing well, if a trader was buying a box of apples, for example, at $10 and that cost has gone to $20, it becomes very difficult for somebody to purchase that particular input. And even when they get to their day-to-day transactions and resell some of these produce, if they increase the price, it becomes very unreasonable for someone to spend, say, $3 on one apple, because then that is termed as expensive. So beyond that, I also thought to just highlight the social sector allocations to the education sector itself. So what we've noted, again, with the education sector, we are signatory to the Echelon Declaration. This is where we have committed to dedicate at least 15 to 20% of our national budgets towards the education sector. So 2015 is actually a year where we allocated about 20.2% towards the education sector. But if you look at the trend from 2016 going all the way to 2021, we've not been able to meet some of these obligations. And it's also very important to note that within these allocations, I mean, these costs are split between infrastructure development, these costs are split between emoluments for teachers, and just ensuring that the country sees these educational outcomes. So particularly with education, I think the challenge that we've noted, especially this year of COVID-19, is that the use of virtual platforms will normally often work for the urban areas. So with the rural population, what we did notice that a number of people did stay at home, were not going to school simply because we've not invested in technological advancement to the extent that we can have learners enjoying their lessons right from their classrooms. And just to speak to this a little bit more, this graph currently projected here is looking at the education budget versus interest payments. So in 2016, you see that we were able to allocate slightly more towards the education sector as compared to the interest payments that the country has. But as we've moved towards 2020, this has not been the case. And this just simply highlights that interest payments themselves have surpassed some of the key sectors that actually need these resources, key sectors that actually need these funds. And then that actually even shows that these are some of the priority challenges that the Zambian government is faced with in terms of ensuring that we do not fail to meet these obligations that we have, but we are also still trying to grow the sector, still trying to educate our population. So I think the last slide that I will focus on in terms of the question that was asked by Iolanda is our social protection sectors. So this remains one key sector within the Zambian economy, because we know this remains crucial to alleviate poverty, to reduce inequalities, and these inequalities manifest themselves in so many different ways. So for 2021, while we've seen a larger allocation go towards a larger budget allocation go towards the social protection sector, past disbursements or history itself has always reviewed a trend that is quite worrisome. And this is where the turnouts have been low. This is where in certain cases, non-disbursement has taken place. So in as much as the budget does show commitment to certain sectors, compounded by rising debt obligations, this simply just tells us that there are cases where commitment to do something is there, but in actualization itself, budget credibility does become compounded by the issue that we are actually discussing here today, and that is debt. And definitely that becomes a challenge in terms of safeguarding livelihoods and protecting the vulnerable people.
Muchimba, that was very interesting, somehow depressing as well, as we realize, as we have been pointing out for a long time, how debt is actually undermining public services and social protection. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what could happen. And one of the options on the table, as Tim was saying, is for Zambia to negotiate a program with the IMF. What implications could that have for Zambia? Is there a risk for actually worsening this situation that you have been explaining to us?
So Iolanda, even as I go back to my presentation, really with any debt sustainability measures, of course, that does bring on board different scenarios. So if you could allow me, I would like to speak to debt management as it has been through the pandemic. Sorry, let me just. Okay, so managing debt, especially through a pandemic such as COVID-19, I think has been a challenge, not just for Zambia, but for many nations. And I could say this is a global scenario. So, you know, of course, COVID-19, as I did mention, is a health crisis. There's not much room that anybody has. We had to stay at home, we had to social distance. So we saw various sectors of the economy actually closing down. So this is just a snapshot for the Zambian scenario. Of course, from March, we did record our first cases in March, and all the way up to September. Of course, it's been dynamic. We've been unable to predict this. So of course, we did have a partial lockdown. We didn't go into a full lockdown because government did realize that that would be very devastating on the economy. Already our GDP, our economic growth is not favorable. And in a case where we have debt obligations, as we do, domestic resource mobilization itself remains very, very important. So I think some of the options that have been taken towards addressing debt sustainability, of course, Tim did talk about some of the eligible platforms that we have. We have the DSSI. Of course, at the time, Zambia was not, of course, catastrophe containment relief trust, and this is because we are a low-income country and a low-middle-income country, and that was only set aside for low-income countries. And this is just to underscore the point that Tim mentioned. Of course, while so many people may be in need, we are looking at possibly having the people most in need receive this relief. So Zambia has received relief from various entities, like we have mentioned, the DSSI, of course, even from the Chinese government. But even just to speak to the debt default itself, it brings on board a very dynamic scenario. And for us, I think as an institution, what we are emphasizing there is that financing development for the country will be very difficult as we move ahead. Of course, the huge debt burden, as I've been speaking to, does affect our public budgets. It does affect the delivery of debt percentage has grown over time. I think we cannot run away from the fact that financing development itself will be difficult, and inadequate financing will pose various challenges to livelihoods, like I did mention. Of course, resources are not adequate to stimulate the economy, and this is through various entities. So to get to your question and to speak to it directly, of course, over the years, Zambia has reached unsustainable debt levels, and this has been established by various entities. Of course, we do have the IMF in the debt sustainability analysis of 2019. These are issues that we cannot ignore. And even for the Zambian government, I think the issue of fiscal consolidation is one that has been a conversation for a long time. So the primary driver behind our budget deficits does remain our debt position. So of course, while an IMF program or IMF support will bring on board that much needed technical assistance, and this is as far as economic reform is concerned, as far as macroeconomic stability is concerned, I think from past experience and from certain or some austerity implications, more often than not, the individuals that will suffer the most are the poor and the vulnerable. So really, to answer the question, it is a trade-off. We can get onto a sustainable path by signing on to some of these programs where austerity measures must be implemented. That will certainly affect a sector of society. So I mean, from previous scenarios, Say, for instance, if government gets onto an IMF program and we're meant to freeze public wages, we're meant to freeze in terms of employing more people. This scenario itself will tell you that if I'm working today and a wage freeze is taking place, the cost of living, on the other hand, is not waiting for that wage freeze. So it's a very difficult question to answer because it's not one-sided. I would say it's two-sided. It's two-faced. It has its positives and it has its negatives. And we're certainly still looking out and supporting the Zambian government in terms of just pursuing a path of sustainability.
Thank you, Muchimba. Indeed, it is a very difficult situation, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to you might think on the situation of their own countries in the global south, but also in the global north. I mean, I can think about the situation in Spain where deficits are growing, and whether the option for the government would be to go for fiscal consolidation, and what impacts would that have on people's lives and livelihoods. Let me end this section by asking you, what options do you see for the future, and especially for the government to face the situation that the default has created?
Thank you so much, Iolanda, for that question. Sorry, it's just easier once my screen is on and everyone can see what I'm speaking to. So for Zambian government, sorry. Looking ahead, I think what I would like to actually emphasize is just to take you back to our national budget. You know, I will keep referring to the national budget because this really is our key macroeconomic framework that will guide any aspirations we have. So Zambia is currently looking ahead at our Vision 2030. That is where we desire to become a prosperous middle-income country. But that long-term vision itself is actualized by national development plans. So national development plans in the Zambian context will normally run for about 5 years. So within those national development plans, it's really the implementation of a national budget that will actually see a country drive towards where they are going. So with the 2021 national budget, and this budget was announced by our Minister of Finance in September, the title, as is presented on the screen, I would just like to read it as it is. This is to stimulate economic recovery and build resilience to safeguard livelihoods and protect the vulnerable people. So with such a title, really, this is something that Zambia needs now more than ever. We could look at the debt sustainability issues, but remaining focused on debt itself will not really pull us out of where we need to be. So firstly and foremost, I think one recommendation that we have is around restoring this macroeconomic and debt sustainability. I did speak to a number of macroeconomic indicators in the country that are performing outside what they should. You know, our inflation rate is at about 16%, when our target is to maintain it as single digit between 6 to 8%. So that in itself will tell you a different story. And really, I think around this debt contraction mechanism, what we need as a nation now more than ever is to strengthen the legal frameworks that are governing public financial management, where debt management does fall in. And it's important to also acknowledge that several attempts are being made by government to review some of these frameworks. I could speak to the Procurement Act that we've noted through our Supreme Audit Institution reports, that is the Office of the Auditor General, that year in, year out will highlight a lot of misappropriation of funds, misapplication of funds. So certainly making strides towards improving this procurement environment is one step. But of course, beyond that, we have key indicators or key frameworks, such as the National Planning and Budgeting Bill. So a National Planning and Budgeting Bill does actually cement the participation of citizens in planning and budgetary processes, but it also provides an element where we can provide this National Assembly oversight, especially where debt contraction is concerned. So certainly that is one area that we can focus on as a country. And it's definitely a prerequisite for good governance. So you see certain laws need to be in place and they need to be enforced to the latter. So the second point that I could highlight is just undertaking this annual debt sustainability assessments to see where we are, where are we going, what strides are being made. Of course, a lot of conversations are currently happening about the Zambian context, and this dynamic is changing very fast. The default was almost 2 weeks ago, but different conversations are happening within this framework. So that is certainly another area that we do recommend as an institution. And beyond that, the issue of diversification remains very important. Zambia is a copper producing country, but over the years, we've become very reliant on copper itself to drive the economy. So diversifying our portfolio would definitely allow us to draw resources from other areas. And this would definitely, in the long run, reduce the dependency on borrowing to finance our budgets, on borrowing to push the agenda of infrastructure development. Of course, that has been an issue of contention in the Zambian context, because then borrowing in itself is viewed as something that is good because we are trying to develop. But the question really that should beg at the back of our minds is, if we are choosing to develop, at whose expense are we developing at? And the issue of debt, just to underscore this point, should also be viewed from the element of intergenerational equity. And I emphasize that because more often than not in the African scenario, money is borrowed today, and this is just an example. This money is spent on infrastructure projects. Of course, with the high levels of corruption, you tend to note that some of the infrastructure that were embarked to develop is not of high standard. So one child, maybe 20 years from now, would be paying a loan that was used possibly to develop a particular area, but that area is in a dilapidated state. So I think at the backdrop of that, really, debt itself should take cognizance of intergenerational equity and not putting our future generation at in a challenging position, as well as the people that are here today. And lastly, I think I could speak to building a critical mass, especially that of civil actors. And this is not the mandate of government only. And even as civil societies, this is an area that we need to tap in. People need to be aware. They need to know that debt concerns you and me. They need to know that as the government borrows, they are borrowing on my behalf. So therefore, it is my civic right to demand accountability from my leader. And just to speak to this a little more, I think the conversation of debt many times is left at a very technical stage, but it's about time that this conversation is broken down to the extent that if a person has to elect their leader, they should be able to present issues of sustainability, because that is really what will keep driving a nation.
Thank you very much, Muchimba. That was very interesting, and I really much empathize with this last part. Let me go now to Jason Braganza and Juana Sotomayor. I don't know if you can switch on your cameras. We ask both Jason and Juana, hello, welcome, good afternoon to both of you. We asked them if they could give us a short comment as respondents to this situation. I will start with Jason Braganza. He's Executive Director of Afrodad. So comments on the default or supposedly default situation in Zambia, and what is the prospects for sub-Saharan Africa, whether you expect other defaults to come, would be the main question. Jason, please, to you.
Yes, thank you, Iolanda, and thank you to Tim and Muchimba for the very insightful presentations. I think at the outset, we probably would like to confirm whether this is indeed a default in its truest form, or is it just a default in terms of legal speak in a contract. I think for us at Afrodad, one of the things we're very concerned about is how the private bondholders of debt, not just in Zambia, but across the continent, are using this sort of language to twist governments to not seek some sort of relief measures through the mechanisms that have currently been proposed, which, you know, also in our opinion are probably not going far enough to address the fundamental issues. And I think it's also equally important that to recognize that there hasn't possibly been a public announcement or by the government of Zambia as to whether this is a default or intends to default on it. What they've asked for, I think, is a deferment because they're struggling to pay. So I think, you know, we need to be very cautious with the kind of the language we're using here, and the kind of signals that this might be sending to the rest of the global financial markets. Of course, when you look at, you know, and I think Tim alluded to this in his presentation around the narrative, if for example, you know, it is classified as a default, then, you know, rating agencies and other bond issuance agencies may reclassify debt from Zambia as junk, and therefore they can be bought at much lower prices. And then the cycle continues as the graph that Tim showed us in the future. But then it also sort of, and that creates problems in itself that we need to sort of think about. But then also, it sort of reinforces this narrative that there's an African risk premium associated with investing in the continent, which is possibly not entirely accurate in terms of how the markets should work, because as we've seen over the past 15 years, there has been, you know, there's been a lot of stability, there's been a lot of progress, a lot more progress to be achieved, but nonetheless, things have been moving. So I think that's an important contextual issue to think about when we're really assessing this, because in similar situations, I think there was a follow-up question asking, you know, are we likely to see this happen, or is there likely to be a domino effect across the continent? And I think, you know, there's a mix of responses here, because just recently as well, both Kenya and Senegal have cautioned against debt relief initiatives because of the kind of signaling it's sending. Yet there are some other countries that are saying that they actually need more debt relief. So we need to be very careful about how we're signaling and whether we're likely to see a string of defaults here. And the reason why I'm being cautious in not saying that we're likely to see defaults is because we need to go back and look at the debt portfolio and the composition of the debt portfolio and what is driving potential defaults. You know, in the case of Kenya, Tim talked about this renegotiation or negotiation of an agreement with the IMF. But at the same token, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in Kenya, in an interview last week, where they tried to sort of push aside this claim that they were doing a U-turn on the DSSI, came out and said, well, they couldn't apply for the DSSI because under their Eurobond agreement, contractual agreement, that if they were to apply for any sort of debt relief, it would be tantamount to a form of default. So we need to be very careful as to whether, you know, this is actually going to spiral on, or are we going to see a tussle across the continent between bilateral private creditors playing this ping pong game? And of course, then we can't ignore China in all of this. So there is a need to go back to the loan contraction, particularly with the private creditors, and just go through the agreements to understand exactly what is happening. Fundamentally, the initiatives that have been put in place are just not good enough. They on the one hand are delaying the inevitable crisis, you know, or pushing it further because you're borrowing to continue paying. So it's just loans upon loans. So you have a problem there, and I think that we need to figure that out. The exclusion of the private creditors onto the negotiating table, I think, is a big factor. And then, of course, there is the issue of China, which we may need to figure out if they do genuinely go and do their bilateral approaches as they've stipulated, then, we need to pay close attention. But of course, what that all means is the current framework and initiatives are very fragmented and leave debtor countries in a very difficult position in terms of who to play and who to negotiate with. And I think, Tim alluded to it, and in my sense, for those who are slightly or not so slightly religious, there's a saying about giving to Paul and to pay Peter, because that's exactly the situation that might end up happening, where the bilateral countries, and maybe including China, might say, yes, we'll give you a suspension or some sort of cancellation, but then that money is immediately rerouted to the private creditors, and therefore it does not find its way back into the coffers of African countries. And thereby, as Muchimba said, you continue with this negative spiral on the socioeconomic outcomes. So we need to look at this very carefully, and we need to look at how these negotiations are going to work. I think fundamentally all three actors, including debtors, then need to be brought around the table. There is a huge role to be played by, and huge benefit to be gained by everybody being brought to the table. I think there is firmly an opportunity also to sort of bring back the conversations around the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, and probably, under the principles of the UN principles, but also to be modernized to incorporate the private creditors, given the landscape has changed so much since they were first introduced and adopted by the General Assembly. And just my last point, really, and this touches both to what Tim presented in his, the lovely infographic there about the structure of the debt, or the portfolio of the debt, and Muchimba's point about the trajectory, is the financial system. The global financial architecture that we are operating within remains fractured. It remains severely broken, and we're not going to find solutions in this broken system. What's likely to happen is the vulnerability and susceptibility to crises is going to shorten. I mean, it's only 10 years since the global financial crisis. So who knows how quickly the next crisis is going to come about. So there is a need, as we talk about Zambia, as we talk about Kenya, Senegal, and other African countries, at the core, there is a need to really rethink the global financial architecture within which the African continent is a very, very important player, as we've learned through COVID-19, with the global lockdown, that a lot of countries have suffered in terms of the raw materials that are exported or taken out of the continent. So, the continent is a very important player in global value chains, and the pandemic has shown that. And so we need to find a way where we build forward better. Thank you, Iolanda.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was very interesting from what you said, and also linking with what Muchimba ended with her presentation. We need to keep on working with this equilibrium between careful expertise analysis on what is actually behind the situation and behind these negotiations, but also ambitious and strong action in terms of demanding these reforms in the international financial systems and economic changes that we need. Thanks a lot. And let me go to Juana Sotomayor. She's a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also working with the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and Human Rights. And I would just ask you, Juana, to comment on the impacts on human rights of what was discussed by our previous speakers. Thank you, Juana, and thanks a lot for being here with us today.
Many thanks, Iolanda. Many thanks to everyone for the invitation. There are a few things I would like to add to these very interesting and very engaging presentations. And I would like to start by taking up a little bit of the point that Muchimba was making about the importance of looking at the national budget. I think from a human rights perspective, the budget is one of the key, if not the most important instrument to implement human rights from the conventions and etc., all the papers, human rights actually become real when budgets make room, assign, allocate adequate funds for those human rights to be implemented. And in this particular case, I think it is important to remember that when we talk about debt from a human rights perspective, we're also talking about how those available resources are being used for specific persons in a particular country. Just to refer to Zambia, we have heard, and it's very interesting, that there were some references by Muchimba to education and social protection. I just want to put a more specific face to that and remind us all that we're talking about a country where between 7 and 8 million people are under 15 years old. We're talking about a very young country with a young population. We're also talking about figures that in 2015 referred to around 54–55% of the population, that is to say, over 8 million people below the poverty line. So we're talking about millions of people who have been affected by the pandemic, who have also been affected by an allocation of resources through the national budget that doesn't necessarily respond to all the needs pre-COVID. And now with COVID, of course, all these needs, which in human rights terms, they are human rights, have become even more pressing. So when we are having this conversation about what is needed, I think it is very important to remember that the discussion about debt and human rights has also to aim at reducing those huge inequalities. How debt cancellation, restructuring, debt relief is actually going to make a difference for specific people in terms of reducing inequalities and in terms of ensuring that this is not a lost decade for these millions of children and young people, for instance. So in this line, I want to also flag that we're talking about transparency in the use of funds. And transparency has to go hand in hand with participation, with information. Muchimba also mentioned that the society, the population, citizens, and civil groups have to be informed of how the money is used, how the funds have been allocated, what sort of accountability there is, what sort of auditing there is at the national level. And these are also human rights issues, because otherwise we're discussing about, we should be discussing also about issues of corruption and illicit financial flows, tax evasion, all these other aspects that play in a country as Zambia, but they play also in several other countries right now, including with the special funds that have been made available for the pandemic. So I would like to remind us that we are discussing about how not only how a particular country is growing or its macroeconomic indicators, but also what quality of controls, auditing, and balances there are internally. The other point I wanted to make is that COVID is still ongoing, and so the needs in this particular juncture, the needs in several countries are heightened by the fact that we are fighting a pandemic with reduced possibilities for economic recovery. Muchimba mentioned tourism, but there is plenty of other issues that should be mentioned, including the fact that a lot of the population is made out of informal workers who have been particularly affected in this pandemic, and within them, women. In this large context, the independent expert on foreign debt and human rights has raised in a couple of documents, including her more recent General Assembly report, the importance of taking in consideration all this very gloomy picture to remind the states, but also private actors and the international financial architecture or international multilateral banks, that debt relief or debt standstill is one of several tools, but what is needed is a more comprehensive, longer term, more structural response, which considers standstill as one of several other options, including debt cancellation. She has been very adamant in saying that without quick, effective responses, but also longer term structural responses, the risk is a systemic debt crisis. And also she has warned very strongly about the fact that every single option that is considered should avoid creating a debt trap for specific countries. And this is precisely what has been explained very, very interestingly, both by Tim and by Muchimba, the risks of a debt trap, or what was mentioned as well, taking from Pedro and paying to Pablo or something like that, which at the end doesn't solve neither the macroeconomic situation, nor does it create a fiscal space and the fiscal capacity for the governments and for the states to respond to their international human rights obligations. Finally, just a short warning, these situations become also very volatile. We have seen in other countries that there is always an easy risk of when there is an economic crisis or when there is a debt crisis looming, the risk of civil and political rights being curtailed, protests being curtailed, or human rights defenders and journalists being prevented from raising their voices. And we also think this is a part of the discussion that needs to be kept in mind. The fact that this is not only about civil and social and economic rights, like health or social protection or food, but also about civil and political rights. And this is where I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Juana. That is very helpful, especially because of the questions that the different participants have been putting on the Q&A box. As some of them, like many of them, Jaume and Dominic and Nick have been asking about the issue of transparency and access to data. I know Tim and Daniel have been answering that in the box, but I would like to ask Tim if he could elaborate a little bit in terms of an answer on what could we do to increase transparency and access to data, especially regarding private creditors. And also, there are several questions for Muchimba. There are a couple of questions regarding asking her for a few words about the CSO Debt Alliance in Zambia and how civil society can support her efforts. And also about the debt that Simone is asking about, the debt that didn't go through Parliament. Whether it's treated or considered as an illegitimate debt, and Samantha is also asking why not make a recommendation to permanently default with a focus to these private creditors, also considering whether these debts are illegitimate. She's saying, can CSOs make the argument to the state that some of these debts are unsustainable, were never sustainable, and hence are in no way legitimate, at least What about the climate crisis, and making arguments that debt cancellation is a settlement of climate debt owed to Zambia. So I'll ask first Tim and Muchimba to answer about these two questions, and then also give the floor to Jason and Juana in case they want to comment. Tim, please.
Yeah, so on transparency, Jubilee debt campaigning allies we work with, such as Eurodad, ever since the Mozambique hidden debt scandal, have been calling for big increases in transparency by lenders. Obviously, ideally, we want transparency from both governments and lenders, but on the lending side, they're just as responsible for making sure that people know about the existence of loans to governments and key details. Our proposal is how you can force private lenders to be transparent is to have a requirement in law that for a loan to be enforceable, it must have been publicly disclosed when it is given, so that a lender is incentivized that if they want in the future to be able to enforce this contract, it has to have been disclosed. But also, probably more importantly, if they want to sell that debt to anyone else, which is what usually happens, the buyer will want to have seen that it has been properly disclosed. There's other ways that it could be done through regulations. So we've been proposing that in key jurisdictions like the UK and New York, where most of these debts are governed. What has actually happened, the private lenders through the Institute of International Finance have agreed a voluntary scheme for disclosing details about loans to a certain list of governments. It's similar to the list of countries that are eligible for the G20 agreements. It's potentially not much use because it's entirely voluntary scheme, so we don't know who will take part in it. And certainly if you're a lender and you want to lend in secret, as Credit Suisse and VTB did in Mozambique, you can just do that and ignore the scheme. But it might lead to a bit more information coming out, and that is meant to be being launched next year. They've just agreed that the OECD will host it. Also this year, the World Bank has started disclosing more information on that is within its database. So before, it used to just say the debt was owed to other governments, but not say which governments, or the debt is owed to private lenders, but not say where they're based. They've now started to give more information on that, so you can see the breakdowns of how much is owed to China, to France, to Japan, and also for not the bonds, but for other kind of private loans, how much is owed to banks in the UK or the US. And one of the questions in the chat was about that. So we know now that 56% of the commercial bank loans to Zambia, not the bonds, are owed to banks in the UK, for example. So we're starting to get a bit of increase in transparency from lenders, nowhere near enough, and there are clear regulations and legal changes that could be made to force lenders to be transparent.
Thank you, Ting. So this is definitely a way forward for us to work on demanding more transparency from private lenders, but also, as you said, also public lenders and from borrowing countries. Muchimba, I don't know if you would like to comment on the questions on civil society in Zambia and illegitimate debt. I don't know if Muchimba's, yeah.
Yes, I've turned on my mic. That is an interesting question. I just want to get back to the chat. So this is about debt which didn't go through Parliament. Is this debt treated as illegitimate? And what are some of the campaigns that we've had around that? Of course, I think one issue, of course, I cannot comment further on this because we did actually have a case in court, and this is where there is a discrepancy between our Loans and Guarantees Act as well as the Constitution in terms of where borrowing rights belong. Is it on one end, the Minister of Finance able to borrow within his own capacity, or on the other end, should all debt that is contracted go through National Assembly approval? And I think in the presentation that I did make, of course, these are some of the legal frameworks or some of the lacunas, if I could call them, that definitely needs to be addressed, because then once the law is very clear on how debt should be contracted, then that is the prudent way that we should go. Of course, I think as an institution, through the National Planning and Budgeting Bill, what we are advocating for is National Assembly oversight in terms of loans contraction. But then beyond that, I would also like to speak to other key pieces of legislature. For instance, the Access to Information Bill that has largely stalled within the Zambian context. So it's some of these gaps to information that make it a bit very difficult for us to easily comment on certain things that are pertaining. So I hope that answers that question. I think the disclaimer really was that this was a case that was in court. So I think I would be doing myself a disservice if I spoke too much on that.
Thank you, Muchimba. Jason, I don't know if you would like to also comment on this issue of transparency.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And just to agree with Muchimba here on the issue of access to information, but also broader legislation around making accessible how loan contraction or debt contraction is done. At Afrodad, we have what we call our African Borrowing Charter, and it sort of touches on some of what Tim has also mentioned, where there's a set of principles that govern how loan contraction is done in terms of transparency, accountability, public participation, National Assembly oversight, and then also issues around the legal and policy framework that, on the one hand, allows for negotiations to go on, but also protects the sovereign state in cases where challenges might arise. And I think this is what the current crisis, not just in Zambia, is highlighting, but globally, is that in developing countries, the legal and policy framework for loan contraction or debt accumulation is still very weak, and a lot needs to be done in order to protect the sovereign state in that sense, and give it a bit more legal support in case of challenges. And then, of course, there's the issue around the macroeconomic principles around how you borrow. It's equally important that when we're talking about budgeting, when we're talking about tax revenue collection, that there are these ratios that are set up, but they're set in law, and that they cannot be arbitrarily changed as and when legislators think they want to. And we've had cases, I think in Kenya, where one of the legislative houses raised the debt ceiling just arbitrarily because they thought it was okay to do that. So we've got to be careful that such things don't take place. I think on the issue of illegitimate debt, in terms of whether it went through whether not just necessarily in the case of Zambia, but generally speaking, whether it goes through National Assembly or not, I think that really boils down to the legal process that's in a country, and one cannot necessarily define that unless we know what is happening. But what's emerging also from this is the need for there to be really standalone, strengthening of debt management offices or debt management authorities, and for them to really be given a stronger role in this process, and working a lot, and perhaps be a bit more independent in the same way, for example, revenue authorities tend to be a bit more independent and away from the politics of treasury. So perhaps that's also something that we could think about at the national level. At the global level, I think there's some of the things that Tim has mentioned. We agree with, but fundamentally for us, Afrodad, it goes back to the architecture. This current financial architecture is just really not working, and we really need a critical mass, as it were, from members of the public, but also a critical mass of developing country governments to stand up and say, we need to change things in that sense. So yeah, thank you. And I apologize, the sun is right behind me in case you can't see me, sorry. Thanks.
We're envious of that sun, Jason. Before leaving you, there is a question on civil society coordination and campaigning in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know if you would like to comment also on that, on what structures or what chances for a bigger campaigning or coordination among CSOs in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yes, absolutely. Afrodad is in the middle of actually developing a plan of coordinating national level civil society organizations. I know Muchimba will be aware of some of the work that Afrodad has been doing in Zambia. But yes, we are sort of collecting different organizations. So please, I'll type my email in the chat box. Please reach out. We are sort of trying to coordinate key policy points where we will be putting together statements, and would love to get input from colleagues from across the continent. So we are coordinating that. There is also a Pan-African group of civil society organizations that comprises of the Tax Justice Network Africa, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, Third World Network Africa, and Afrodad, under the umbrella of the Stop the Bleeding campaign, which is an anti-IFF's campaign, of which now the debt issue is very much wedged within that movement. So you can find a lot more out there on the Stop the Bleeding campaign, and we will be putting together statements and information on how we can do that.
Thank you, Jason. Juan, I don't know if you would like also to comment on the different questions, or if any of the speakers, team or Muchimba, would like to do a final comment. If not, and 2 minutes to the closing time. Muchimba? Yeah? No.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat. This is speaking particularly to a CSO debt alliance here in Zambia. So I think this debt discourse has been one that is as a means of strengthening our advocacy efforts. So JCTR is currently leading a CSO alliance that will be launched sometime this month. So really the aim of that committee, and with leadership, and we are engaging or intend to engage closely with Liput. So we have the international debt framework itself, we have international debt lenders and all those entities. So really just to emphasize, I think it's more about understanding the complexities associated with debt. And I know the question dates to the pandemic. I think as an institution, this is one area that we have been advocating for, largely because we know that is where the poor and vulnerable in society tend to be housed. And also, I think past trends have rightly noted that debt servicing itself is affecting social sector spending. And this is what Juana did actually bring out in terms of the human rights perspective. So I think, yeah, those are really areas that we are still investigating around, and those are advocacy areas even for JCTR and the entire CSO Debt Alliance and various actors within the Zambian context.
Thank you very much, Muchimba. Since we are already into our 90 minutes and we don't want to, and there's people starting to leave the webinar, let me just say we will share the recording of the webinar with everyone who registered, together with the presentations, and we will hopefully be able to put together different links and resources that were shared in both the chat box and the questions and answers. And for sure, we will continue working together, not only on Zambia, but on many different issues. I think that it was clear that together with the work for a more fair, multilateral, orderly and transparent debt resolution framework, we need to continue our analysis work, our very rigorous analysis work on what's going on, also looking at the what's behind the scenes on the private creditors, and definitely putting the issue of transparency and responsible lending and borrowing on the table strongly. And that's what we will continue doing for the rest of this very exceptional year, but also for next years and the years to come. Thank you everyone for participating, especially Team Muchimba, Jason, and Juana. Thanks a lot to our interpreters. They've done an amazing work through all the 90 minutes. Thank you very much to Ilaria and Daniel behind the scenes with all the technicalities and answering the questions. Well, we will continue working together. There's a lot of work, so stay safe, take a good rest, and we will see each other very soon. Thank you very much.